Hello, and you're watching the fourth episode of the KurosawaCast. My name's Rob Beams, and I'm joined as ever by Craig Ennis. Hello, Craig. Merry Christmas to everybody. So basically, if you're listening for the first time, the gimmick of the show here is Craig is new to the world of Kurosawa, filmmaker and film teacher, never saw a Kurosawa film before, and I am a big fan of his movies, and we're watching them through chronologically. So up to this point, we've been doing 2 films an episode, getting some of the early films that we maybe thought we'd have a little less to talk about out the way early doors. And the intention, as you'll know if you listened last time, was that Drunken Angel, 1948, his first film with Toshiro Mifune, his big star of his kind of most celebrated movies, was going to be the first one where we'd do that one on its own. As you can probably already tell from the title, we're not doing it that way. We are going to talk about the Quiet Duel afterwards, because I think we've probably both got a little less to say about that. We're going to be covering those 2 films today, 1948 and 1949. So last time around, we talked a little bit at the end of the last episode about the first Toshiro Mifune film. I suggested you watch it. I don't think you're able to find a copy of it anywhere, called Snow Trail, which was a film that that Kurosawa wrote, and it was directed by, I've not got the director's name to hand, but I think it was directed by the guy who directed the film that What's Up Tiger Lily, the Woody Allen film, is a dub of. You know, the first Woody Allen film as a director is that one with the it's like a Japanese Bond parody that's like got some quite unfunny dubbing done over the top of it. And that's the director of that film is the guy that made this Kurosawa script, and it's the first Toshiro Mifune film. And
so it's Senkichi Taniguchi.
Yeah, that's the fella. Thanks, Craig.
That's all right.
So basically, Toshiro Mifune arrives on the scene in 1947, his first movie, as I say, written by Kurosawa. And in that movie, he plays, I guess, a gangster, not quite a Yakuza like he does in Drunken Angel, which we'll come on to, but he plays a bank robber, him and Takashi Shimura, who's been in all the Kurosawa films, I think, bar one up to this point, and is one of the lead characters, kind of co-lead in Drunken Angel. Him and Toshiro Mifune are 2 of these 3 bank robbers who go and hide in the mountains. There's these local old man who lives in a hut who they take advantage of, and they hide in his house, and things kind of get ugly.
It sounds like the sort of thing Tarantino would remake.
Yeah. Well, it would be good if he did, actually, because it's kind of it's an interesting kind of fun little concept. And Toshiro Mifune comes onto the scene in that film, and I'll just give a little bit of context for him before we start, really, because most of the space that Kurosawa dedicates to talking about Drunken Angel in his autobiography is basically him just fawning over Toshiro Mifune and talking about how he encountered Toshiro Mifune. And it's a kind of fairly, as a lot of Kurosawa's autobiography, there's some humble bragging in there. It's a little bit of false modesty, because he sets himself up as the guy that basically discovered Toshiro Mifune, and then goes, "Oh, but of course it wasn't me. I'm not taking credit." Like afterwards, but basically the story he tells it's so funny, because if you saw a biopic and it was about either one of them, Toshiro Mifune, Akira Kurosawa, whatever, and this scene was in the biopic, it would seem like the hammiest, like every scene in Bohemian Rhapsody where someone like walks in and just goes, "I've got it, guys," and then they just say like, "We will rock you, what about that?" And it's just that sort of like biopic scene where they come up with the things in the most obvious sort of way. It's kind of like that. Like, what happened was he was making No Regrets for Our Youth. So this was like 46. And the studio, as I mentioned on the episode where we covered that, the studio just had this big exodus where loads of their established stars had basically fucked off and joined a new studio, founded a new studio called Shin Toho, New Toho, and that left the studio without stars, which is the reason that One Wonderful Sunday starred 2 non-names, and they were able to film a lot of more naturalistic stuff on the streets because they didn't have any star actors at the studio at the time. And coinciding with that, Toho put out an advert saying that they wanted new faces. So they got thousands of people coming to the studio to do these auditions. And the story as Kurosawa tells it, and like I said, it does sound a little bit too good to be true, but the story as Kurosawa tells it is he was making No Regrets for Our Youth, and somebody came in, one of the actresses, I think, from one of his other films came in and said, Kurosawa, you've got to come and see this bloke who's on the in the auditions in the other room. So Kurosawa goes out to see this bloke, and he walks in, and Toshiro Mifune's in the room ranting and shouting and really angry. And Kurosawa didn't even know he was acting. He just thought this guy was like really angry with something. And then he realized that he was performing rage as an action, as an emotion. And he was like, wow, I was really blown away by this guy. And what happened was basically that there was a panel of judges who were assessing the people, who were assessing like the auditionees, and they were split evenly because the studio, part of the issue and why Shin Toho was formed and the kind of strikes that happened at the studio was the union taking more and more control over production of movies, and the panel was basically evenly split between industry professionals and people that represented the kind of the union. Of the production crew, didn't really necessarily know anything about movies or about acting necessarily, as Kurosawa tells it. And so what happened was the union people felt that he was disrespectful to them. Kurosawa talks about seeing Mifune acting kind of shy, and it's often talked about with Mifune that he was quite a rough character, and which comes across in a lot of his parts. And so the panel, particularly the union guys, apparently took it as him being very disrespectful, and they were about to pass on him. And Kurosawa, this is where it becomes kind of a My Week with Marilyn type biopic. Kurosawa apparently like burst into the room and told them, "No, wait, this guy's got something," and like got Mifune sort of passed through the doors basically. But it wasn't me that did it, he was very talented, and it was the other people that made him a star. But Kurosawa sort of paints it as he was the guy that sort of saw him and fought for him to be in the movies. And we'll never know how true that is, but it's an interesting story. But he so Toshiro Mifune comes in, he does this audition, and the first film he ends up making, Snow Trail, is of a Kurosawa script. And I said on the last episode that Drunken Angel was his second film. I think it was actually his third film. And the significant thing about that to know is that not only in Snow Trail did he play a criminal, but in his second film, which I can't remember the name of, he also played a gangster. And then in Drunken Angel, he's playing a gangster. So something that becomes important as we start to talk about Quiet Duel next is that Toshiro Mifune very early on in his career gets typecast straight away as this kind of rough gangster with a possible heart of gold, or a kind of wild gangster criminal guy, which is what we see in Drunken Angel. So last time round, I always asked you like, what's your prediction based on the synopsis, because you kind of go completely blind on the movies. Remind us what your prediction was for what Drunken Angel. What was your sort of expectation for it?
Well, it says on the BFI player, part gangster film, part melodrama, part social critique. So to me, that sounded very much like Sam Fuller, basically. Not sure. I'm not sure everybody would be particularly will necessarily be familiar with Sam Fuller. I mean, he's a famous name. It's not quite fair to say unsung, but he's certainly not as well known as other directors of the 50s. But Sam Fuller was this kind of ex sort of tabloid journalist who moved into filmmaking and did these very kind of bombastic, politically charged social critique films that weren't necessarily particularly subtle, often quite angry, but surprisingly measured and thoughtful and kind of politically quite nuanced.
Yeah, they were B films basically, but they were like really high quality B films where I can imagine very easily that they overshadowed the A films wherever they were played. And his most famous film is Shot Corridor, but I went on a bit of a Sam Fuller binge early this year, and I think Steel Helmet was probably my favorite if anyone wants to dip into Sam Fuller. Really good one.
Yeah, so that's how I got introduced to Sam Fuller. I had to write an essay about Steel Helmet during my degree, so that's how I discovered him. But yeah, that's what I thought. I was expecting something to be quite. I was expecting this to be quite. I don't know, quite bombastic in some ways, and quite.
I suppose it is as well, right?
Yeah.
Do you feel like you got your Sam Fuller worth from this?
More or less, yeah. I mean, It starts off with quite there's quite a surprisingly graphic bit of violence at the beginning with a pair of scissors that I thought was surprising. In powerful insight here.
I'll ask as well, because you've come into this as well, obviously blind on the Kurosawa movies. So this will also be your introduction, I think, to Toshiro Mifune, unless you saw him briefly in 1942 and other random things he's been in. And obviously, he comes with a reputation as this great Japanese actor, this major star of Kurosawa's movies. I'll read an excerpt just of how Kurosawa described him, and then I'll ask what your expectations were and sort of how they were met. So basically, Kurosawa says this on first seeing Mifune act. He says, Mifune had the kind of talent I've never encountered before in Japanese film world. It was above all the speed with which he expressed himself that was astounding. The ordinary Japanese actor might need 10 feet of film to get across an impression. Mifune needed only 3 feet, and he put forth everything directly and boldly. And in his sense of filming was the keenest. Sense of filming, it's my terrible handwriting, but his sensibility was the keenest I'd ever seen in a Japanese actor, and yet with all of his quickness, he also had surprisingly fine sensibilities. That's how Kurosawa described him. He talks as well. He goes on from there to talk about how he's not easily impressed by actors and that he was kind of just blown away from him. And he devotes a lot of time to talking about there's a lot in that chapter about how sexy he thought Toshiro Mifune was, and how he was slightly worried that Mifune was too sexy for the film, and that he was going to be so sexy that he was going to make gangsters sexy, and that poor Takashi Shimura was going to be so overpowered by Mifune's sexiness that no one was going to care about the Doctor. He goes on about that for a while, and he throws Shimura under the bus further when he says that if Shimura gave 90% to the performance, Mifune gave 120%. So he doesn't even say that his man Shimura was batting at 100%. he says Shimura turned in a 90% of capacity. And
that's some Jose Mourinho level shade right there on his own players.
So how does that bombastic?
The thing about he like right from the off, like you see Mifune, he's striking. Like he's just got incredible sort of cheekbones and chin. He looks like a movie star.
Yes.
He is, and yeah, he is a very sexy, handsome man. It has to be said. But he's got that sort of brooding intensity thing going on right from the off. Like it's a sort of there is a kind of there's shades of young De Niro kind of. I know it's a bit of a cliche to say, but that the brooding is there. That's where I noticed that sort of thing before would be De Niro or Pacino in The Godfather or that kind of thing. It's got that instant kind of recognizable, that instant magnetism to him. He's just so incredibly watchable and kind of entirely magnetic. Like I wasn't expecting that. Like it was you can see why Kurosawa picks him as a muse from the get-go and just works him over and over again. He's really, really good.
There's something I always find in his best roles, and obviously you'll come on and see these later on, but his best roles, I think there's something kind of animalistic about Mifune. His character in Seven Samurai, his character in Rashomon in particular, and you see that in Drunken Angel, where he'll get Mifune in these roles that call upon him to sort of like sweat and pant and pace and kind of almost kind of stalk around like a jungle cat at various times. And I kind of get that from him in Drunken Angel right from the beginning.
To be honest, I mean, he's really good in this, but I mean, we'll move on to the Quiet Duel, but it was the Quiet Duel that even sold me on him even more. Not to preempt too much about what I've got to say about the Quiet Duel, but he does a lot with very little in the Quiet Duel. Like there's I've got a few issues with the story of the Quiet Duel, which we'll talk about in a bit, but he's still really good in it, and he still commits to the role completely.
And something we'll come about with that was that
we haven't actually really talked about what the film's about yet.
No, we'll get that in a second. But I just wanted to say as well that in the Donald Ritchie book that I've also been drawing from, which is kind of the definitive critical look at Kurosawa movies, he talks about Drunken Angel. He starts to talk about Drunken Angel by saying that Japanese critics have agreed that this picture is to Japanese cinema as Bicycle Thieves is to Italian, and that it marks the major breakthrough of a major directorial talent where he first realized himself fully. And he quotes Kurosawa saying about the film that he was surprised by this idea that he had been made a breakthrough or finally realized his talent or something, because Kurosawa apparently said of it, I've undergone no major change. The only difference is that in my earlier films, I was never allowed to express myself properly. So this is, by all accounts, whether you see it as the coming of a great talent and the new Bicycle Thieves, or if you see it as just the shackles being off, this seems to be marked as Kurosawa's first proper film, as it were. And I don't want to dismiss the ones we've already seen, because there were some really good ones, but this is kind of where it really kicks off in terms of his filmography, I'd say. So do you want to talk a little bit high level about what the film is?
Yeah, so there's a doctor, Sanada, played by Shimura, who's kind of working in this sort of slum, basically, isn't it? It's kind of a bombed out part of the city, and there's this wonderful swamp that sort of is opposite his house. That everything sort of I don't know, all the action of the community sort of happens around this swamp, doesn't it? It's a recurring visual motif. It's Mifune's character, Matsunaga, gets into is a local hoodlum, gets into a fight, is injured, and has to come to the doctor to be treated, basically. And Sanada doesn't really have any sort of truck with the hoods and the gangsters and the lowlifes, but his kind of Hippocratic oath kind of compels him to treat him anyway. And then
without anesthetic or being nice.
Yeah. He doesn't kind of, and then he kind of discovers through treating this wound that Mifune's character has also got tuberculosis, and he sort of sees this not as, there's an element of I want to treat you, but it's also, this is a contagious disease. You're going to pass this amongst the community. You're already damaging the community as a gangster. I'm going to do my part and try and control this disease to stop you spreading the actual disease.
Yeah, like you spread social disease already.
Exactly. So there's a none too subtle metaphor going on, but it's played really, really well. And part of this is that Matsunaga's drunk, and the drinking's not going to help the TB treatment, and so he's constantly convincing him to stop drinking as well. And then into this sort of mix comes in, is it Akada? Is that the name? The
former head gangster who's just come out of prison and is kind of taking over again, reasserting himself.
Who is reasserting himself and is kind of like an overboss of Mifune, and kind of complicates the whole situation. And once again, Kurosawa shows he absolutely knows how to introduce a villain. There's this brilliant scene where Akada is kind of sort of comes out of prison, comes into the kind of square, and there's this man playing guitar, like a constant refrain of somebody just sort of noodling away on a guitar in the background, isn't there?
Yeah.
And he just kind of wanders in and takes over the guitar and starts playing a little something himself, and it's called something really on the nose, isn't it? Like the Killers
Yeah, I can't remember
Killer's
exactly.
Lament or something
Yeah,
like that.
exactly, something like that. And there's a really kind of Hollywood line where the guy's sort of like, "Oh, that's a great tune. What's it called?" And he's like, "Yeah, it's called The Killers, whatever." And he hands the guitar over and like walks off. And it cuts to like there's a nurse working for Shimura's character who used to be sort of his girl and was sort of abused by him and just wanted to get away. And she hears this tune, this Killer's tune across the thing. She's like, "Oh shit, that's a Carter's song." So he uses that scene really well to sort of set this guy up as being bad news coming back into town. I think you're completely right about him kind of bringing villains in very well.
Yeah, is that something that carries on throughout? Is it?
It's not something I've really noticed particularly, so it's interesting. I think we'll see. But yeah, it's something I'll pay attention to from here on in. But you're completely spot on because right from Sanshiro Sagate sort of has a penchant for the villains, doesn't he? But yeah, so that's that basically something. I don't know if you mentioned that Shimura is also an alcoholic as well. So they're so it's kind of ambiguous by the end who was the Drunken Angel, I guess, out of the two of them.
Which again, there's when we get to the Quiet Duel, there is an ambiguity in the title of what the Quiet Duel actually is as well, isn't there? But what I would also say is that the start of it is apart from like this, this really nice scene, and it's not particularly flashy when it comes to the wipes and the edits. There is if they're saying this is as important as who is it saying in the book that this is kind of recognized as the bicycle thief. Yeah. There is a social realist kind of element to this for the first half at least, where it is quite it's not overly stylish. There is something that starts to come up in the films that I've started to notice, where there's always really nice staging and framing of sets as well, showing off the sets or the locations. There's this kind of diorama thing going on, like in the scene from One Wonderful Sunday where they're fighting at the top of the steps next to the concert hall, and here when you're looking out through the windows over the swamp and everything else that's going on, there's a lot of style in the way that the framing and that kind of thing is put over. But it's very good as well. It's very quiet. It's very quietly filmed for the first half at least.
Yeah, I was going to say it's very good as well at establishing place. Like, I know this is the obvious person to pick on for something like this, but Michael Bay, for instance, there are so many cuts and so much spinning around. You never really get a concrete sense of where characters are in relation to each other or where locations are in relation to each other. And just as an extreme counterpoint, obviously there are other people.
Best extreme counterpoint, and I'm sorry to bring this up. Have you ever seen Now You See Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, the first one at least. The camera is almost constantly circling around, like in orbit around whatever it's filming. So if you watch that again, I mean, I know we're talking about Kurosawa here, but if you watch Louis Leterrier's Now You See Me, the camera is in constant orbit around the characters. It never stops. It makes you so dizzy. It's really funny. But anyway,
but more than just the sort of the moving of the camera, I'm sort of getting at as well that there are lots of films where you don't get that concrete sense of space. And in Kurosawa movies, you get a very clear sense of space established. Like in this set, because it is a set, because basically another director was making a gangster film about black markets, and they had this set. And Kurosawa was asked, "Can you make something on this set?" And that's why they started writing this film. And the difference they made to the set was flooding it and making that kind of corrupt kind of that metaphor for the kind of bubbling corruption of post-war Japan, of the open sump in the middle. But other than that set is really well established where everything is. Like you feel like if you stepped into that world, the locations and where they are in relation to each other.
That's what I kind of mean about this diorama kind of thing.
Yeah, you can see like where the guitarist was in relation to where the doctor's surgery is in relation to walking down the streets and going to the bar or going to the club. It's all kind of in that little area, and it all feels of a piece. It all feels like a place, and it's something I really admire about a lot of Kurosawa's films. You get that in probably most famously, Seven Samurai, because it's a movie where at one point they literally draw a map on the ground in dirt and say, this is where the hut is and this is where the windmill is. So there's a very clear sense of setup. And I really like that. Like, I feel like on one hand, that seems very sort of pedantic and like, okay, who cares? But on the other hand, it really does make me feel like I'm in a place. It makes me feel more immersed in the movie. To have that.
And I completely agree. And for for the longest time, it sits more or less in this place, and it's this really good kind of. It's mainly the kind of the relationship between Mifune and Shimura, and then when Okada gets introduced, there's some these quite strange sort of stylistic flourishes and changes of tone, and that work really, really nicely. Like there's a bit where they go to a nightclub, and Sonata kind of falls off the wagon completely. But they go into this nightclub, and there's all these oversized playing cards on the wall, and there's people having, and it kind of it's got this massive energy to it, and the set starts it goes from this realist thing to something that looks like a bad guy's villain from the Batman 66. And then there's this kind of really sort of crazy dance number, and Mifune gets really drunk, and he starts dancing, and he starts like really contorting his face. And I made a little note here saying that it was almost like Lon Chaney levels of face contortion. Like there's you can see there's real kind of range in him as an actor. I don't know, does he play any sort of comedy characters later on in his
not comedy characters, but I think you'd probably argue that like in Yojimbo and Sanjuro, which is the sequel to that, he's definitely kind of wryly funny. And I guess his character in Seven Samurai is kind of funny as well at times, because I think never the out and out comedy character. No,
but I might be completely off base there, but my thought was that he plays another sort of alcoholic in Seven Samurai. That was kind of what I thought I knew about it. And
kind of, yeah. He's not explicitly kind of said as an alcoholic, but he does. Yeah, he likes to drink.
Okay,
he drinks a lot of sake.
It becomes, that whole scene is much more stylish and seductive. Like in the underworld, it is portrayed as something that is appealing. The nightclubs and the dancing and the energy and the drinking and the women. It's not. I get the idea that. I mean, we'll talk about Quiet Duel again in a minute, which I thought was quite moralistic, and I get the impression that Akira Kurosawa is probably quite hardline on a few things. Is the impression I get, but he doesn't shy away from saying that although he doesn't like these people, he understands there is an appeal to it. There is seduction.
Yeah,
to it.
It's sort of like Scorsese does in gangster movies, right? Like one of the things people criticize Goodfellas and Wolf of Wall Street is the idea of showing the kind of the appeal of that life. I'd argue he does that less here, because he has quite a strong bent through this film of really wanting to have, particularly the Shimura character saying, "You guys are scum. You're ruining everything. I hate you. Put your life out." Which I'd say that he's clear.
It. But in this scene, in that one particular scene, it's definitely there.
There was a tension about this in the making of the film, actually, which is worth. I'll just segue quickly into that because I'd forgotten it at the start. He co-wrote this with his childhood friend Yagusa, who co-wrote One Wonderful Sunday with him, and all of his films up to this point, when you read his autobiography, he makes a great play about how he wrote them in one night. Like they're always something he just did in one. Oh yeah, I wrote it that evening, and it doesn't give a shit. In talking about Drunken Angel, he talks about how hard it was to write and how long it took to write, and that the main source of the contention at first was they couldn't figure out how to make the Doctor interesting, because they originally wrote him as this young kind of humanist, very moral, very kind of white as white sort of character who was going to basically be this kind of, he was unblemished, just heroic Doctor. And it wasn't until they went drinking with this mouthy doctor that didn't have a license in the slum somewhere, and they heard all his stories, that they realised that would make the character more interesting. So they actually based it on a doctor they met and went drinking with, and then they turned it into this alcoholic guy that Shimura plays. That's kind of the kind of bastard with a heart of gold sort of type, and I think he's a much more compelling character because of it. But the other thing that took them some time, and some of the most sort of Kurosawa's Partridge quotes sort of come from this section of the chapter, are the arguments he had with his co-writer, because basically Yagusa, the co-writer, spent a lot of time with gangsters to research this film, and he started hanging out and getting very friendly with gangsters. Kurosawa, as you identified, being quite moralistic compared to this, was really annoyed with this and was arguing with him, saying, you're getting too involved in them and all of this. And so Yagusa wanted the movie to be even-handed, in a sort of, the way you're describing actually comes through apparently, which is the way of it being where you can see the appeal of the life, you can see that they're not just villains. But Kurosawa wanted to admonish gangsters a lot stronger in the film, and it led to a bit of a fallout, and it's why they didn't work together again. And Kurosawa goes on a bit of a rant. He goes on a bit of a kind of.
I mean, that's interesting. Happens at this point again when we get on to talking about the Quiet Duel, because the Quiet Duel isn't as it's quite similar in a lot of ways, but a lot less subtle.
Yes,
and it's a bit, it sounds to me like I mean, I'm sure as we go further, there's going to be better, but it's like the thing where it's like Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant. Like when they write separately, Ricky Gervais stuff is too is probably a little bit too nasty and overly saccharine to compensate, and Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant stuff just isn't funny enough.
but with this, you get this situation with this film where they have this falling out over how the gangsters are being presented, and Yagusa makes all the arguments that I would probably make, that Kurosawa slams in his autobiography, about these people being born from the society that they're in, and them having their own sort of tragedy and their own lives, their own backstories that sort of support why they've ended up where they are, and being driven to it by society and circumstances. Kurosawa says the thing that every argument with someone who's not very sort of socially minded, when you point out that society can be the root of problems, when he says, basically in his autobiography, I've not written down the quote exactly, but he basically says, yeah, but loads of other people live in that society and they don't do that. It's like really much that comes across. He kind of gets the last word in his autobiography saying that.
Yeah, he's starting to come across a little Daily Mail. It has to be said.
He's also Michael Caine always has this line of being sort of, he's a very Tory Michael Caine. He's very right wing, and Michael Caine's particular brand of being a right wing working class bloke is that idea of saying, look, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and you're just lazy for not doing it, and that sort of aspect. Look, I came up and I did good, so you can as well. Yeah. And Kurosawa does that here as well.
You go and star in some films in the
60s. Yeah. So like this Yagusa bloke, he was saying, look, the difference between you and me, Kurosawa, is apparently, he said, look, you're a very strong person, but I'm a very weak person, he said. And I can understand why other people like the Yakuza are very weak people who fall into this trap. And you wouldn't, because you're strong, but I feel like I identify with these weak people. And Kurosawa said, no, I'm a weak person as well. I'm just like you. I just try harder. Basically, that's what he says. There's this autobiography about how he just works really hard. And, he kind of tries because he doesn't want to seem weak. So he puts on a strong mask to be strong. And, it's again in the autobiography. I'm reading it now and thinking Kurosawa comes across as a bit of a twat. But the interesting thing about it, though, is that the Quiet Duel accepted, because we'll come on when we talk about that. The Quiet Duel's a stage play, and Kurosawa didn't write it. So we'll sort of come on to that. It's its own thing. But what I find odd about this approach in his autobiography and about this conflict on Drunken Angel is that Kurosawa, as I mentioned before, is noted for his humanism. And most of his films, most famously with Rashomon, but also going things like Seven Samurai and Ikiru, are films about people who are going against conservative social traditions and trying to and seeing the good in all people and seeing the good even in the kind of villainous characters and things like that. So it's very odd to me that he's coming across this way now, but it's funny anyway. But
he's 38 at this point, isn't he? So I guess he's you know, I mean that's depressing. I'm 38. But yeah.
So yeah, this is the movie that when I was first into Kurosawa and I was watching them all, as I've said before, I was watching them all in the university library. This is one that was one of my early favourites. I have a lot of love for this film, and I think it was one of those. Have you ever seen a movie where you're not that into it most of the way through, and then one scene completely like blows your mind, and then you're hooked into it?
Because there's certain films that The Witch was like that for me, and it's a really great film about the Flemish farming mafia called
that one. Is what I was going to say. That one, yeah. What's that one called again?
Bullhead.
Bullhead. That was great because the thing is, again, that's very long, quite slow, and I wasn't that into it. And then the final scene,
30 minutes, isn't it?
The amazing ending, and then the whole thing kind of in my mind now. It's this great film. It's like the bit in Adaptation where Brian Cox says, "Wow them in the end, and you've got a hit." And for me, that was very much the case of Drunken Angel, because as you kind of identified, you didn't kind of use these words, but the first half is more pedestrian, right? Like it's fairly straightforward. There aren't that many flourishes. It's neatly done, and it's nice enough to watch, but it's nothing that special. The ending of the film for me, where
Bill Bergman.
when he it's the scenes in particular where Mifune is sort of staggering ill down the corridors going to try and stab the guy, and they end up having that panting. This is very characteristic Kurosawa movies where killing a person is never an easy thing in a Kurosawa movie. It's never an elegant thing. It's never a cool thing. It's always this kind of rough, sweaty, scary, both people are terrified, scrappy thing. And these two gangsters kind of fall around on the floor. They look ridiculous. Neither of them are cool. They slip around in loads of paint comically.
Oh, God, yeah.
That's what makes Mifune kind of bright white, which kind of gives the visual at the end of him perhaps being an angel. And he kind of stumbles out onto this balcony and then crashes through and then falls kind of Zack Snyder Christ-like on the balcony. And it was that sort of sequence of the movie that really sold me on it and really got me into Kurosawa. I think that sequence,
and then there's this really unusual kind of Bergman-esque fever dream sequence just before on the beaches, isn't there? With the coffins and the it's like this. There's this. It all goes slow motion, and there's coffins in the sea, and it sounded to me like the soundtrack was reversed as well. Like the music sounds reversed, and there's this really kind of. I'm saying Bergman-esque. I'm no Bergman expert, you know. I've seen maybe 2 or 3 Bergman films, but that's what it felt like. And again, just a strange little departure in style just for a little while. And obviously I'm again, like I say, no Bergman expert, but I'm guessing this predates Bergman.
Yeah, they talk about the dream sequence in the Ritchie book, and he talks about it being fairly sort of not pioneering, but very strange for a Japanese film to do this. Certainly a film that was grounding itself in a kind of realism up to that point to do this. And apparently a lot of critics at the time criticized it for this scene kind of being out of place. I was struck as well by he finds himself in the coffin, right? Which is something that Ritchie points out has been done in some other films that Kurosawa was a fan of in the past. Someone having a dream where they look at themselves in this kind of way. But given how much George Lucas is very obviously in debt to Kurosawa, he couldn't help but think of Empire Strikes Back, you know, in the cave where Luke sees himself in the...
It's got the same sort of staggering slow motion kind of...
Yeah, and so it's very interesting to me as well because of how obviously Lucas has already taken like the wipes and he takes kind of various plot elements from Kurosawa's films. So it's kind of a fun, I don't know, coincidence or an influence, but it's interesting.
There was also just a couple little bit. There was this. There's also a nice little bit of dialogue talking about sterilizing this contaminated town that sounded a little bit like one day great rain will come along and wash all the scum off the streets, and you know you could. There were bits in here where you could sort of go. I can see that. I can see that through line through all of the sort of the auteurs that followed, who kind of who cite him as an influence, you can start to see little bits of the through line from Lucas and Scorsese, possibly Bergman. I don't know enough about Bergman, but you can see those through lines now. You can start to see all of it. I can start to see the influence in ways that were present, but not as clear before.
Yeah, there was something. I'm just looking at my actual notes from watching the film here, and there's a couple of things I wanted to mention about this film before we move on to Quiet Duel. One is there's a scene very early on when he's removing the bullet from Toshiro Mifune's hand, and Toshiro Mifune's kind of sitting there waiting for him to remove the bullet. There's a really great scene, I thought, really great kind of funny scene that's also really good for establishing the Shimura character's character, where he's more concerned with a door that won't stay open than he is with the guy with the bullet in his hand, because the guy with the bullet in his hand is a gangster. So you've got Mifune just sitting there watching while Shimura just continually opens this door, it swings closed, he opens it again, it swings closed, he props it up, and you've got this gangster sitting there with a bullet in his arm the whole time. And I thought that was a really neat way visually. It's kind of a funny moment, but it's also a nice visual way of saying this is how much this guy doesn't give a fuck about this gangster. There was also something I really liked, which is you have a scene where Shimura and Mifune are walking through the town together, and Mifune's kind of shaking down all the stalls, and they're all bowing to him, and he's taking what he wants, something like that, because he's this gangster in the community. And you see that deference everybody else has to have for him, and that stands obviously in stark contrast to the Shimura character, who's always cussing him out and pissing him off. And I just think that's kind of funny as well. It's one of the things that makes the Shimura character for me so likable in the film is how, I guess he's a kind of misanthrope, but just how much he doesn't seem to care for his own well-being in his dealings with the gangster.
For me, it's the most sort of satisfying of the films. There's bits in the other films that might be more endearing or whatever, but this has kind of got this real kind of what we've seen so far. It's got this kind of Shakespearean scope to the melodrama, and it feels like a really, really well-contained, complete story, and I really liked it. Really liked Drunken Angel. I thought
I think Kurosawa does here that I think Scorsese fails at in his gangster movies. In my opinion, is I think Scorsese buys into the idea of the honor among thieves a bit. I think he does, because he grew up among people like that, and I think he knows a lot about that world. But I think he's also kind of slightly bought into the idea that there is a code, and there are these kind of these guys that are interesting in their kind of internal way. A little bit. I'm not saying he kind of.
I would disagree, and I would disagree based solely on the Layla scene from Goodfellas.
Okay. I was going to say here
where it just goes through all the people that Robert De Niro kills, so he doesn't have to share his money.
Fair enough. Good point. But I think it's easy. Okay, maybe this is more of a kind of people getting the wrong end of the stick thing, including me potentially. But it's easy to come out of Scorsese films thinking gangsters are cool.
Definitely, and to go off on a rant that's completely something else entirely, and not for this podcast. That was my problem with Wolf of Wall Street, because I understand what violence means and what shooting somebody means and what beating somebody up for some money means, but the scope of cheating people out of their savings on trading and all that kind of stuff, and the trickle down effect that has on families and employment and things like that, and the way that has its tendrils that go out, so it doesn't have the same. People don't have the same understanding of what cheating somebody out of their money.
Yeah, so I think this is what I'm talking about, because with Scorsese films, because I felt Wolf of Wall Street was intending to be quite critical of the character, and there are lots of ways we could talk about why I think that is. But obviously it doesn't always come across. It doesn't come across for everybody. And I think that one of the things, and maybe this is because it's more didactic, maybe this is because Kurosawa's less subtle, but I really like the fact he just calls out gangster codes as bullshit several times. He calls them out very overtly in dialogue, having the Shimura character say that all their gangster codes are bullshit, but he also shows that they're bullshit by having the Mifune character buy into them, believe in them, take stock in them, and then get completely betrayed and sold down the river by his boss. In that sequence where he overhears them talking about how they're just going to kind of just throw.
He's a wild dog because he's dying anyway. Yeah,
and all of that. And there's also a line in it about how Japanese make pointless sacrifices, which seemed to me to be another fact that this is a kind of a movie made in 1948. Kind of interesting. And I think that I remembered this film as being a lot more post-war in its kind of interests than it actually is. Like, actually watching it again, I don't think it has a lot to say about that. But I think the whole idea of it being set in this idea with a black market, with gangsters, with this kind of open swamp in the middle of the town, says something about how contemporary Japan at the time, how they must have felt coming out of the war, how a lot of the society and the codes and the things are kind of fallen in on themselves, and there was a lot of corruption and opportunism and crime, and I think it's kind of interesting time capsule as well in that kind of way. I love how ghoulish Mifune looks in a lot of it. Like, you could probably
on, isn't he? He's got, like I say, the cheekbones and that facial structure kind of really plays into that.
I could easily, like, if somebody argued that the makeup was a bit overdone, I wouldn't necessarily argue, because it's really overt. He's got this kind of really heavy makeup on, but it works so well. Like, he looks so sick, and it's I really love this film anyway.
Speaking of Mifune playing sick.
I just want. No, that's a good segue. Craig, thank you. I have one note I wanted to bring up. And it's because I've noticed this in a lot of Japanese films that are set during sort of similar period. And I've got a note here that just says a loose egg purchase. And I love a good loose egg purchase. Like you see all the time in people walk up to a stall with just a load of eggs, and then they just walk away holding some eggs. And I was just like, there was no like, do you want a bag? He's just like, no, I'm just going to carry them in. Just walks off with his 4 eggs home. But yeah, I love a good loose egg purchase. You see it a lot in cinema of the era. Maybe egg boxes weren't invented yet.
Quite possibly.
But anyway, so yeah, your much more sensible segue into another film where. So sum up Quiet Duel. What's it all about?
Quiet Duel. I didn't have the BFI player to back me up on this one, so I had to watch it on YouTube. So I read the synopsis on Wikipedia. Again, it's not laziness; it is a conceit for the podcast. So this is so what I knew about this was that Mifune plays a surgeon who quietly tries to treat himself for syphilis that he contracted during an operation. So to me, this very much sounded like a kind of prestige melodrama, reaching for Cumberbatch if you've got the budget, and then sort of working your way across through Redmayne, Hiddleston, and then if you can only get it on telly, maybe a Matthew Good, which is probably unfair to Matthew Good. But anyway, that's what it sounded like to me. And I have to say, like, when it first starts, like, the start of this film is brilliant. It's like really, really, really strong. Like, it's got this real, almost cold opening, startling start. It's really startling and it's really intense. So that it's kind of
over the kind of monsoon rain in the jungle and
just this lashing rain. There's people in jeeps. You can't really hear what they're saying. There's really minimal dialogue, and then they kind of, there's all these soldiers in various states of distress and injury, and everywhere, like piled on top of each other. Like, there's this real sense of like mass destruction and injury and threat to life in these horrible conditions. And you kind of go to this hospital. It's not very well appointed. It could be like a MASH unit, or it could just be some sort of makeshift place, but it's clearly not. It's not state of the art, and the it's hot. and you know the Mifune is being asked to be fanned, and he's kind of sweating buckets, and this guy's on the table, and this all the pressure's on. Nobody's really saying anything. There's so little dialogue, but it's all done through the action, and you can see that they've been going for hours, and he kind of takes his gloves off because he's sweating so much that he needs to get the purchase, and everybody's kind of on the edge, and he puts his scalpel down on the side of the table, and the camera just lingers on it, waiting for him to slice his finger, and it just kind of comes in and it nips him, and then he has to finish off the operation with an open wound on his hand. And it's
interesting that that you kind of highlight this opening sequence,
and the sound is amazing as well. The sound, and there's a leak in the roof at one point, and it starts dripping through, and that's kind of the mix. It's all silent. It's not like people moaning or wailing in the background. It's virtually silent. It's just the sounds of things being picked up, put down, and the dripping rain into a pan. Someone says, "Do something about that," meaning fix the roof, and all they can do is pick up like a kidney bowl or something and put it to collect the water so it doesn't drip on the patient. It's really strong filmmaking.
It's interesting that you bring up the opening scene because undoubtedly it is. I think it is the best part of the film. What I think is actually quite a solid, sort of fairly leaden film ultimately. But it's interesting. Kurosawa said about the film according to the Ritchie book, he said that that when the locale moved back to Japan, from this area at the beginning where they're off in the war, when the locale moved back to Japan, somehow the drama left the film, he says, and
which is weird because it's what basically happens after that point is all the drama comes out of action, stops being a film, and people just start talking at each other constantly, really, don't they? So the idea is that so what happens is he contracts syphilis from this patient, and that he's got a fiance waiting for him, and she's been waiting 6 years for him to come back from the war, but he's now got syphilis and he's going to try and treat himself. He can't bring himself to tell her because she'll wait for him. He just acts really cold and tries to push her away whilst treating himself for this shameful disease, and it becomes, I hate to say it, basically becomes a soap opera
it does. There's a Donald Ritchie actually sums it up in his book, because he always has at the beginning of his essay about each film a very detailed plot synopsis, and after the plot synopsis for Quiet Duel, he basically writes, for most films the plot synopsis would just be the beginning. There'd be lots of things to talk about, but for this, the finished film isn't any more interesting than the synopsis would indicate, and he's very dismissive of the movie. And it's interesting that Kurosawa, you can kind of tell as well in Kurosawa's autobiography which ones he's into, because for Drunken Angel there are 2 chapters that talk about it, one of them mostly about Mifune and one ostensibly about making the film, and they're fairly long sections. Quiet Duel's over a couple of pages, and all Kurosawa talks about in his section about Quiet Duel is how the studio he made it was very nice. It was by a river, and the people that worked there were really kind. He talks about. The only other thing he talks about is that there was a really long take in the film. There's a take in the film that's about 5 minutes long, one of the scenes, because it's a fairly static movie, isn't it? He often does.
And again, I think one of the other things that makes it feel a little bit like a soap opera is you're either on the ward, you're in the hallway, you're in his office, and that's pretty much it. It's kind of. And they do the geography of the place is good, but it feels like that sort of soap opera geography where they're clearly sets that are
exactly. But he has this thing where the only other thing he talks about with this film is that they had this particularly long take they were going to do. Nobody could get any sleep the night before. The actors were scared about it. He was scared about it because it was this long take, and a 5-minute take was very long at the time to do in a Japanese film. So they do this long take, and he says, and again, this could be just bullshit because I don't know why this would be true, but he says that the cameraman was weeping so much filming take, and that because the cameraman was weeping that hard doing the take, the whole way through, Kurosawa wasn't looking at the action, he wasn't looking at the actors, he was watching the cameraman and hoping that through his teary eyes he was still capturing the events on the film. And he was just kind of, again, it's a very Partridge section where he's watching this man crying and all he's thinking about is like, oh, I hope he's getting this on camera, bastard.
It's just like there's just some very, very weird things going on in this film. Like most of it is this is what I meant about Mifune, like, because he hasn't really got an arc. He's just kind of doing this thing where he's kind of struggling, he's being stoic and quiet, and he keeps it in his face, he keeps conflict in his face, but there are points where he has to verbalize what he's going on about, and the reasons are melodramatic and soap opera, but he carries what he can from the character really, really well, and he's still got that real kind of presence to it. There is this kind of student nurse character as well. What's her name? It's really difficult to find the name of the character because it's in most of the places it's kind of probationary nurse is the character name, but she is mentioned towards the end.
She's the bar lady who loves Toshiro Mifune's character in Drunken Angel, the actress.
Minagishi, I think the character's name is, and she's just this kind. She starts off as this horrible caricature of a woman who's come in for an abortion, who's like, "Oh, you've made me work here, and I just wanted an abortion.
I just want to kill my baby and go out drinking, you slag." Yeah, no, she's dimensional.
And then he gives her this like pro-life rant.
Yeah, exactly. But something I wanted to say about the production of this movie, because in a way it seems similar to me to Tiger's Tale, which we talked about before, and I'll explain why. But basically, what happened around the production of this movie was there was another strike at Toho. There had been 2 previous big strikes at Toho with the studio, and then there was this third strike at Toho. I'm not going to go into the details of it because it's a bit of a saga, but it involved all the production staff locking themselves in the studio, keeping the management out, and taking these huge wind fans that we use for like interior like wind scenes and whatever, taking them, putting them at the entrances to the studio so they could throw cayenne pepper in them and blow it in the eyes of the police if they tried to come to the studio. So it's this mad saga. But basically what ends up happening is the management do get the studio back. And Kurosawa vowed he was never going to work for those management again. He wasn't going to work for Toho as long as they were there. So basically he leaves Toho, where he's made all his previous films after that. And him and a couple of other directors, one of them being Naruse, who's another celebrated director of this era, they formed their own production company. And basically, the reason Kurosawa made Quiet Duel is because they'd formed this new production company, and they were quite inexperienced. They didn't have all of the experience of the crews and things and the studio that they had at Toho. So he needed to make a much lower budget film, a much simpler film. And so he saw this play and he thought, well, that Toshiro Mifune bloke's great. I think he'd be amazing in this play. Plus, Toshiro Mifune's fed up of being typecast as gangsters. So wouldn't it be great to get Toshiro Mifune to play this doctor in this play and show his acting range? So he envisaged the whole project around having Mifune in it and then making something that was quite easy to make. And the reason I liken that to Tiger's Tale is I remember you saying at the time when we'd come off The Most Beautiful, looking at Tiger's Tale, how circumstances had kind of caused him to go backwards after a film. How the progress kind of dipped, and I really feel like that with Quiet Duel. I feel like Drunken Angel, when you watch Stray Dog as well, like Drunken Angel to Stray Dog, that's a good like go up, but this is a little bit of a dip.
There's also, I mean, there's a couple of other things. I haven't got much more to say about it because I think you know, soap opera is the best way to describe it. But there are a couple of strange little things about the moralism, other than the pro-life rant. One is the kind of the moralism of it all. Because there is this idea that it's a shameful disease, and if you have it, it's your fault. And that's kind of there's this kind of caricature. The character, the soldier that he contracts it from, comes back and is this alcoholic, wife-beating monster liar character later on in the film. But there is this kind of thing where his father tells him that he's ashamed of him, and then he explains how he got it, and then he's like, "Oh, I did you wrong, son." And there's this kind of weird kind of. It reminds me of that kind of thing
around like
thing around AIDS. Yeah. Like, oh, they got it from a blood transfusion. You know, that kind of.
Yeah.
That kind of. Yeah.
The old brass eye, he's got good AIDS, you've got bad AIDS.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that. There's really, and there's two really tonally like really offbeat that don't fit in with the rest of the film sequences. One is about a kid who's having an appendectomy, this little comedy kid who's just sort of cheering everybody up in the hospital, and there's a subplot about him needing to fart in order to eat. What's that?
You're going to bring up the fart celebration.
Yeah, there's a song and dance scene when he farts, and everybody in the hospital's like, "Yay, the kid farted," which is really weird. Yeah. And the ending gets really, really dark because, like I say, the guy the guy from whom Mifune contracts the disease, goes back to life, gets his wife pregnant, and passes it through. And the baby has congenital syphilis, which I looked up a little bit, and it causes certain it can cause certain birth defects from that are wide ranging basically. But they play it so there is like a birth scene for this baby or a stillbirth scene. I couldn't quite tell. It's not entirely clear because there's another baby making noise. But there is this suggestion that this baby's been delivered with severe defects and that you can't see it, and people go into a room where there is this child, this infant that is horrific to look at, and people are going into the room. And it's just like, this is really, really dark. And one more thing actually is the scene where Mifune breaks down and basically says, like, and has this kind of rage, like, and he basically says, "I'm down to fuck, but I'm not able to." Like, why is this me?
Yeah, basically. Which I feel was kind of progressive for the time, because of the fact that even across Ozu's films, which are about relationships and love and things, which Kurosawa films aren't, no Japanese cinema, or really in a lot of Japanese culture, talks very openly about sex. And so that scene where Mifune is talking about how he really just wants her body is really like, it's such a weird anomaly in like 40s Japanese cinema. Like, I've never seen anything like in another film like this. Something I wanted to mention was there's a really nice little, I don't know if you registered it or whether it was something that was stood out to you, but I really liked, there was a nice bit of business where it's him and Takashi Shimura, who plays his father. And after he's come out about the syphilis being good syphilis and not bad syphilis, they have this weird comic exchange where Shimura goes to light his cigarette, but Mifune's already lit his, and he's gone to lit his father's cigarette. This weird, like, it would be impossible for me to describe, but there's kind of a strange kind of silent clowning bit of Chaplin-esque business around the lighting of a cigarette that goes on for like, I don't know, 20 seconds of that. And it was quite deftly done, and it was quite sweet between the two of them. It was a nice little moment. And it was another thing like the opening that I imagine wasn't on the stage play, or in that form. And there's one more thing is like, at the end of the movie, because some of his staging around the baby stuff and the hallway is really compelling. Like, he does the same thing he used in Drunken Angel. You know the bit in Drunken Angel where Mifune staggers down the hallway to go confront the boss and then kind of disappears into the room, and then you hear, like, violence break out and that kind of thing. There's a similar thing in this movie where the guy staggers down the hallway, and I just think it's a really nice image. There's also a nice bit where they go up on rooftops, and there's these, like, I think it's like laundry lines or something, and that's a really nice comparison.
There's some really nice set work and very good kind of diorama, kind of beautifully staged scenes of the setting. Like, they look like that's something that is definitely consistent, is kind of this is his sense of geography and the kind of staging a real tangible world that it feels like you could reach out and touch or step through the screen to. I think the other thing, I mean, the other thing about this as a melodrama, I think it's probably suffered over time, as attitudes have changed. I think it might. I've got nothing. I can buy a melodrama every now and then, but the kind of the moralism of it and the way that, it's basically about his noble struggle to deny his fiancée agency to make her own decision.
It is. There's also
and the good syphilis, bad syphilis stuff that doesn't really resonate
abortion.
these days, and the abortion stuff and all that kind of and all of that. And the idea of suffering in silence and not looking for help and all that. It's all kind of the drama is the kind of the drama and the moral dilemmas are sort of outdated, and that doesn't help.
Something that's dated as well is the fact that, I mean, I'm aware that TB, because I Googled it, I think TB still kills a lot of people annually, so I don't want to trivialize it. But the thing as well in the developed world and in the privileged places where we live is that TB and syphilis are not life-ending. Someone tells you have TB now, I think within the UK or something, there's medication that can remedy that, I think, fairly easily. I think. Again, I'm not an expert.
There was a good documentary. Oh God, I think it's called Bending the Arc. I think that's what it's called. That's about the work of people in Haiti. I think it was around sort of WHO and treating TB, drug-resistant TB from the 80s onwards. So that is it's been an ongoing fight. It is still something that is that people are working with, but certainly it's not something that we worry about.
About the same way. So it's kind of interesting. I would hazard a guess that neither syphilis nor TB are treated with that sort of like grim-faced sort of like, oh God, my over in Japan now as they were in 48, 49.
And again, like because of not really knowing much about syphilis, I did do a little bit of Googling, and I saw some articles that saying that congenital syphilis was on the rise. Actually, like the numbers have been going up, probably through a lack of awareness. And
they're both almost issues films, aren't they? Like they're both films that if they were done in Hollywood these days, they would be nominated for Best Picture, and everyone would be really sniffy about them. I think, even though Drunken Angel, I will maintain is a really great movie. But yeah, I just want to share my screen again and go to what we did last time around, which is we have our I know what. Can you see that?
I will do. Yeah.
So basically, what we've been doing since last time around is pitting the Kurosawa films against each other in a kind of a rating system here for Craig of enjoyment versus appreciation. You see, the current loser with the least enjoyment and appreciation is The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail, and up on the top quadrant here in the top right is No Regrets for Our Youth and One Wonderful Sunday, sort of up there. So where is Drunken Angel going, Craig?
I think it edges both No Regrets and One Wonderful Sunday ever so slightly. Edges them both on both counts.
Like this area?
Yeah, that looks about right to me.
And the Quiet Duel?
The Quiet Duel, so in terms of appreciation, it's probably a little below halfway. And it's probably, I would say, the most beautiful edges it on both counts.
So you think it's like there?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, that looks about right to me.
Fantastic. So there we go. I've cleaned it up.
If you just look at that again, just for a second. For a second. I just want to go back to the point that you made about the backward steps.
Yeah.
See if that's to see if it's available on our Moneyball graph. So the idea was Tiger's Tail is a backward step from the Most Beautiful. So it drops quite away there.
About the same, probably about the same distance between these two as between what am I talking about? This and this, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it's even more. He's failed. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but I think from here on in, I said this about Drunken Angel. I was like, okay, strap in, Craig. We're there now. I think from here on in, we might be one film an episode, but we'll play it by ear. I think it's possible we'll bundle two in again together, but I guess we'll base that on how much we've got to say about the two films in any given stretch. But yeah, a mixed bag this one. But I'm glad you've seen Toshiro Mifune. What are your expectations for the next one? So the next one is Stray Dog. Let's, for the sake of argument, just in case we end up doing two again, Stray Dog and Rashomon are the next two films.
Oh, so Letterboxd lied to me. I thought it was going to be Scandal.
Scandal. No, it's Scandal. You're right. I was basing it on. I need to pan over slightly to the right on my graph. Yeah, no, Stray Dog then Scandal. Rashomon's next. So Stray Dog. What are your feelings?
So it says Akira Kurosawa's masterful mix of film noir and police thriller on the sweltering mean streets of occupied Tokyo. When rookie detective Murakami has his pistol stolen from his pocket while on a bus, his frantic attempts to track down the thief lead him to a illegal weapons market into the Tokyo underworld. But the gun has already passed from the pickpocket to a young gangster. And Murakami's gun is identified as the weapon in the shooting of a woman. This sounds quite intricate. Murakami, overwhelmed with remorse, turns to help his older and more experienced senior Sato. A superb performance by Takashi Shimura. We've got a double act going on. It's the race to find the shooter before he can strike again. I mean, there's a lot of things. I'm not particularly au fait with film noir, actually, to be honest. It doesn't sound too much like that, or police films, classic police films. But that's got a very kind of freaking Frankenheimer sound to it, to me. So that's what I'm hoping for. Scandal again is one I don't think was on the BFI player, but I think it's about some sort of paparazzi kind of journalist, isn't it?
I'll be upfront about Scandal. I saw it once many years ago, and I can't remember almost anything about it. So it's almost going to be a new one for me.
Okay. Paparazzi tabloid entrap them town, plot their revenge by having breakfast on a balcony and print it under the headline "The Love Story of Miyako Saijo." This sound again. I mean, sorry to repeat myself, but this just because it's about newspapers and print media, it sounds like Sam Fuller to me again.
So a little bit of homework. Last time I was unsuccessful in you being able to watch Snow Trail. This one's much more accessible because it's on Disney Plus. When you've watched Stray Dog, watch Series 2, Episode 11 of Clone Wars, the Star Wars animated series. Series 2, Episode 11. It's an episode called Lightsaber Lost. So watch. It's like a 20-minute remake of Stray Dog with Star Wars.
I've definitely not seen that, but I definitely, the idea of somebody losing their weapon and having to track it down. I'm sure that's cropped up in some other things, but I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think. But I'm sure by the next episode that will
your memory will be jogged.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to it. Looking forward to it a lot.
Awesome. Well, that concludes episode 4. So come with us next time for at the very least Stray Dog. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to watching that one again and discussing it with you. So yeah, thanks again. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. Cheers.
Bye-bye.